Wow. Thank you for tuning in. Appreciate everybody that's making time to be here. Much love and respect. I'm actually doing this right from my phone. Okay, so just bear with me. I'm still dealing with my nerve pain, so I'm in bed. But we're going to still read. All right, a book I have here. Just a quick, well, not quick, but we're going to get the drop from this book right here. The book is called The Red Atlantic: American Indigenes and the Making of the Modern World, 1000 to 1927, by Jace Weaver. So I go to page 35 of this book, where in chapter 1 it says here, "For he looks upon you as a foolish children, captives, slaves, and prisoners of the Red Atlantic." And it says here, the late Jack Forbes, in his provocative book, Africans and Native Americans, and you guys know we read that book a lot, read a good book, we're still going to read full chapters, where it says that he notes a curious incident reported by Pliny the Elder in his Naturalis Historia on the authority of Cornelius Nepo. Pliny states that Quintin Metellus Celer, who was a colleague of Lucius Africanus in the consulship of Rome, while in Gaul, received the gifts of Indos, who on trade voyage had been carried off course from India by storms to Germany from a Germanic chieftain. All right, guys, so right away, we have a very good video on this. Like, basically, what they're letting you know is that the so called Romans in Gaul, right, the area they called Gaul back then, met Indians from America. This is way back in so called ancient Roman times, guys. American Indians had made it to Europe. They had met Indians. Remember, we got a whole video on this. We even mentioned this the other day in the other book, America Before Columbus, the one we read the other day, 2, 3 days ago. They mentioned this. And look, this is a whole other book mentioning the same thing. Okay? So it's in their histories. Pliny the Elder wrote about it. This is a primary source, guys. This ain't, and they literally said India. They came from India. Remember the true India. But remember, that's in the Atlantic. India's not on that side, right? So they were talking about North America, India Superior, or India Magna, Greater India. That was the true India. Remember that India, the country we know today, just got its name, India, in the 1940s. Before that, it was called Hindustan and then Bharat. So India in ancient times meant something else, guys. I hope that's clear by now, all these years, right? So here's another reference of this encounter: American Indians in so-called Roman times, Romans meeting Indians. All right. Continuing, it says, Forbes says that the event, which would have taken place around 60 BC, right? That's how old they're saying, right? According, most likely Middle Ages, right? And the presence of Indians in Germany would have been explicable to Pliny because he believed they sea connected the Indian Ocean with the Baltic. Such a waterway is, of course, fictitious, Forbes writes. We know, however, that the only way people looking like Indians could have been driven by a storm to northern Europe would have been across the Atlantic from America. All right? From America. That's what they meant by India. They were coming from America, all right? He speculates that these might have been Olmecs or the builders of Teotihuacan. Who ended up over there? Wow. We're talking about real seafaring nations. We're talking about the first seafarers. We're talking about the people who explored the whole world. We're talking about people from the true old world, right? It makes sense here. There is much reason to doubt Pliny's account. His ethnographic materials are largely fantasy, and Forbes overlooks that it was Columbus, more than 14 centuries later, who labeled Western Hemisphere indigenous Indians because he thought he had reached the Indies. All right, so we know that's a hijack, right? So this guy's trying to say no, Forbes don't know, but that's a real source from Roman times, guys, and saying that Pliny uh, wrote about fantasy stuff. That's conjecture, and that's like so. Basically, why do we quote Pliny then, at all? If Pliny's can be trusted on this account, then his whole book, Naturalis Historiae, shouldn't be counted as, for anything. Then they should apply that for everything. But you see, they just sugarcoating it. This is like the conversation I had with AI the other day. Just because modern scholars don't want to accept it doesn't mean it's not real. That's a primary source. Okay, guys, that's a primary source telling you. So yeah, the whole Columbus naming Indians India, that's thrown out the window. Columbus knew exactly where he was going. He knew it was India Superior. He had met Indians in 1470 in Ireland. He knew where he was going, guys. If we discount with fulfillment of fanciful speculation, the first indigenous North Americans to reach Europe were almost certainly Botox. All right, we dodged the hijack. I know why he's saying that. He's trying to say when Europeans got here. So, dodge the hijack. But watch what it says about the Botox. The Botox were enslaved and murdered heavily. Okay? The Portuguese enslaved the Botox, murdered them, took their location. They sent most of the Botox to Cape Verde. Yeah, Cape Verde Island as slaves. All right, so it says the Botox, members of an ancestral population thereof, and like Pliny and Forbes Indians, they were captives. Either way, we're talking about slaves. We're not talking about Africans being enslaved, right? Captives, who? Botox. They were merely the first of over thousands upon thousands of Western Hemisphere indigenes to become captives and slaves, okay? We're talking about real slave trade. These natives would find their way to Iceland and Norway, England, France, Portugal, Germany, Bermuda, the Caribbean, and other islands of the Americas, and even North Africa, among other far flung destinations, okay? And again, even Cape Verde, West Africa. They were bringing Indians all over the world, guys. They're telling you right here, all right? So, it says here, two Botox boys. Leif Erikson sighted the northern coast of North America in approximately 1000 AD, calling it Vinland. So again, we agree, like the sagas of you know, these people, what they call them, the Vikings, Norsemen, they really were going back and forth to America and to Europe. But we might be seeing it in reverse, or we might be missing context before those travels. Like, who is Leif Erikson? Do you guys know that his ancestors called Eric the Red, right? Eric the Red supposedly came here too, to the Americas, right? So Eric the Red Man, hey, that might mean something, guys. There, maybe his ancestors were actually coming from America, and then they were just going back and forth trading, But either way, people have crossed the Atlantic way before Columbus, okay? And so again, Vinland is another mythological land that literally is the Americas, but in the sagas, people treat it as a myth, but it has become mainstream acceptance that this was the Americas, most likely Newfoundland, most likely Massachusetts, New England, right? Shortly thereafter, around 1003, the Vikings founded a settlement in present-day Aux Meadows, Newfoundland. Okay, like I said, they were in Newfoundland. This is Greater Ireland. They were coming back to Greater Ireland, or the true old world. They knew where it was. They encountered Red Indians. There you go. Red Indians. So why is his ancestor called Eric the Red? As distinguished from the Inuit, whom they called Skraelings. You see how they distinguish the Eskimo from the so-called Red Indians, or copper-colored tribes of America? And they call the Eskimo Skraelings, an archaic word of uncertain meaning, but commonly assumed to mean something like wretches. These meetings are recorded in the Icelandic sagas, okay? It's all over their primary sources. According to the Grænlendinga saga, encounters with the natives were initially friendly. Despite the language barrier, trade was open, but the relationship soon turned hostile. In Eric's saga, we learn that Leif's brother Thorvald was struck in the groin by an arrow in one skirmish with Skrellings. As he pulls the arrow out, he poetically and tragically says, "This is a rich country we have found. There's plenty of fat around my entrails." Then he expires nobly. All right. So they were like, "Hey, this is a beautiful place. We gotta do something about that." So you see how they're supposedly the Eskimos having beef with the Vikings. Controversial historian Jamie Sokolov summarizes: the Vikings treated the Skrellings as they would any other outsiders. When the opportunity arose, they killed the adults and enslaved their children. On other occasions, they traded bolts of red cloths for furs. So even the so-called Vikings were enslaving American Indians, right? After Thorvald Ericsson's death, the Vikings fled. They spotted 5 natives, a bearded man. So you see how they're saying Indians had beards, 2 women, and 2 children. Though the adults managed to escape, Thorfinn Karlsefni and his men captured the boys, whom they took with them. All right, so look, they're bringing Indians back with them, maybe. The boys were taught Norse and baptized. Thus, in 1009, Indian captives were taken to Norway and perhaps Iceland. Okay, look at this. They have sources for this, guys. It's in the sagas. The Vikings wrote literally that they came to the Americas and that they literally took back slaves with them, guys. And they never told us about this. They want to talk about African slaves, but you see, if these people were brought back to Europe, and this is 400 or 500 years before Columbus, wouldn't that story travel? Wouldn't people know by then that there's actually people on the other side of the world? And especially people who had access to these sagas and writings, primary sources. So that by the time Columbus came about, that's what I'm trying to tell you guys. He knew where he was going. He knew that was so-called India. Huh. So they spoke their language and everything, right? They ended up in Norway. The names of these boys forcibly orphaned are not recorded, but those of their mother and father are. According to the sagas, the children identified them as Ovatilt and Ovagir, respectively. Jennings, Wise, and Vine Del Loria Jr. say that the boys were christened Valtolf and Vimar. You guys hear that? They became Norse, part of the culture, part of the people over there. They got names and everything. They learned Norse and everything. They got baptized and everything. Huh? Baptized, huh? They forget who they are. I bet you they had wives. They mixed, right? They spread their blood. This is very interesting. I never really actually read about this. So we're going to follow up on this. Continuing conflict with the Skrellings or the Eskimo, right? Convinced Carl Symphony of the futility of attempting a permanent settlement in North America. According to Gwyn Jones, his numbers were small and their weapons inadequate. They were unwilling to woo and unable to conquer. So that's their excuse to why they didn't stay, I guess. The fact that they took the boys and taught them their language is strong evidence that they intended to continue trading with the region's indigenous people. Walthoff and Vimar would be able to serve as interpreters. Such abductions became an established strategy in this regard. The penultimate chapter of the Gralendinga saga begins. Remember, that's a source, that's a primary source from Norway, right? From the Vikings, so called. So it says in this saga, now there was renewed talk of voyaging to Vinland, for these expeditions were considered a good source of fame and fortune. You see? It was a normal thing to come to the Americas, right? Annette Kolotny writes, obviously, the potential threat posed by the native population has not dissuaded some individuals from further expeditions, although there is no longer any suggestion at attempting a permanent colony. The Vikings continued visiting the North American coast in search of timber and furs, but after 1300 the climate grew colder and travel became more difficult. Eventually, they ceased entirely. Around 1350, the Vikings abandoned the western settlement in Greenland, and by 1500, Settlement on that island ceased entirely. By then, however, Greenland's days as jumping off point for North American exploration were long in the past. The last record of a specific voyage to Vinland was that of Bishop Eirik, probably Eirik Gnupsen, in 1121, and we do not even know if he reached it successfully. According to Dutch anthropologist Harold Prince, however, there is an intriguing historical snippet about a large canoe that Newfoundlanders natives were putting into port at Lubeck in 1153. You guys hear that? We're talking about a large canoe, we're talking about a boat, a large ship. The Vikings ships, guys, were literally large canoes. It's the same thing. The Phoenicians as well, guys. That's what I'm trying to tell you. These people are coming out of the true old world eventually. The first navigators, the first people to cross the Atlantic, the first people to use Greenland as a stop point between America and Europe were Americans, not the other way around. The Vikings came later. They were just coming back to that land they knew existed. Okay? But here they're telling you, hey, they have, you know, sources telling you these stories. Prince concludes that if the incident happened at all, both natives and canoe most probably came on a Viking canar. All right? A Viking canar, that sounds like canoe, right? Canar, canoe, canar, I told you. Years later, circa 1420, Inuit captives were taken to Scandinavia. Their kayaks were displayed in the cathedral at Tromsø, Norway. You see even more Indians over there. This is before Columbus came, so you don't think Columbus knew about this stuff? In 2010, DNA analysis of contemporary Icelanders revealed a strain of mitochondrial DNA most closely associated with Amerindian populations. The so-called C1 lineage is carried by more than 80 Icelanders, and church records have permitted researchers to trace a specific substrain or subclade, known as C1E, to four women from shortly before 1700, though they believe it arrived much earlier. C1E has been found only in Iceland and does not match Greenlander or any other Inuit population, nor does it precisely match any modern native population. Since mitochondrial DNA is passed down only through the female line, the logical conclusion is that it entered via a woman from some now extinct Amerindian lineage. The Beothuk, the last of whom died in 1829, would seem the likely candidate. Rasib Khan, a science writer for Discover, writes, perhaps the Europeans had enslaved a native woman and taken her back to their homeland when they decamped? Perhaps. But more likely to me is the probability that the Norse brought back more than lumber from Markland, since their voyages spanned centuries. It is certainly possible grabbing a few North American indigenes quickly became a standard operating procedure of European sailors, and the Vikings certainly had a reputation for being rapacious. Remember, they were called the Black Invaders, the Black Heathens. Remember when the Vikings, were invading the Picts and all these people in the British Isles? They were called the Black Invaders, the Black Heathens, because they were swarthy, a lot of them, so called black. All right, but the point is, they're trying to let you know that it was a thing to come to the Americas, Europeans, right, and grab slaves from here and take them back or do whatever they, did with them, as captives. Now, though Valtov and Vimar, remember, these are the Indians that got named in the sagas, right, may have become the first Amerindian cosmopolitans, the Vikings departed for their homelands and left no continued colonial presence in North America. See, because they're probably looking for something they think is Viking when there's probably something that was already here, so you're not noticing it. You think whatever you're finding here, but you guys know that they found Punic, Icelandic writing. They found, what's it called? I forget the name of the Viking writing, but they found all that stuff here, guys. Ogum, all that. We've shown the sources. The traces are here. But they're older here. They're more classical versions, so that means they were first here and brought to that other side of the world. So their clashes with the natives and their capture and kidnapping of the two Beothuk boys, however, established a pattern of European interaction with the continent's indigenes that would be replicated many times over. So American Indian slavery is massive, guys, throughout the years after that. This is what they downplayed to us. This is a large portion of our so-called slave population of the Americas. Is the actual local people. That information undoubtedly traveled from the tribe to tribe beneath the fall and beyond through trading networks. The seeds of distrust and knowledge of settler violence and indigenous captivity were sown from Newfoundland to Florida. All right, from Newfoundland to Florida. Unfortunately, for the next people to be discovered by explorers from Europe, they were not part of the trade routes that would have carried word of the Skrælings. Difficulties with such people. And it says here, a man obsessed. Now be ready to dodge the hijack on this part, guys, because I'm gonna talk about Columbus. It's gonna talk about Columbus and the mainstream narrative we already know is false, right? We know that's not even his name. Columbus' real name is Salvador Fernandes Sarco. He was a Portuguese Jew. He was a black man, and he knew he was coming to the Americas. He was never lost. He's not from Italy. He's not from Genoa. He's not from any other place. He's not from Spain. You know, all those are, just added false narratives to hide his true identity, right? But let's just read what it says. Just make sure to be ready to dodge the hijack. And it says here, a man obsessed. Christopher Columbus was a man consuming personal ambition. He was also a man of many obsessions. These two aspects of his personality were symbiotic. His ambition drove him to multiple obsessions, and in turn, the objects of his obsessions became, he believed, the means to fulfill his ambitions. All right? So again, I was going to say he was born in Genoa, Italian coast, whatever, that's not. So it says little reliable is known about his childhood, you see? They don't know anything, but they want to say he's from Genoa and they want to name him, right? But it seems he went to sea at fairly early age, alternating between voyages of the Mediterranean and periods on shore, working for his father. So this is something we knew from sources, real actual sources that state that, he was like navigating since he was like 14 years old. He was already a very expert navigator. And so he had a lot of knowledge of navigating, guys. He knew about the Americas. He knew about the stories of Atlantis, the Greek stories of mythical lands, all that, the sagas of the Vikings, all that, guys. He was never lost, okay? Without formal education, he became an autodidact, reading and internalizing the travel accounts that were popular at the time. 7 of the books he owned survive. These include Pliny the Elder's Naturalis Historia, with his traveler's tales and fantastic ethnographies, Marco Polo's exaggerated report of his journey to China, and Pierre Diali's Imago Mundi, all right? Again, he read Pliny the Elder's story about him meeting Indians, guys, from so-called India, so he wasn't just making things up. And they're leaving out his encounter in 1470 with Indians. And remember, Marco Polo came to the Americas. They say when he went to the farthest east, they don't know where he went because they can't find the places. It's because he crossed the Pacific. He came all the way to the Americas. He met the Grand Khan, most likely King David, the King of Kings. Right? So Columbus had all this knowledge, so-called Columbus, right? It says published in 1410, the last of these, written by a French cleric, was an imaginative, pseudo-scientific cosmography. Such works fueled Columbus' imagination, like I said earlier, right? And his desire to travel to exotic locales. He knew it was there. The Aili book in particular influenced him. The Aili suggested the possibility of reaching Asia by sailing west from Europe. Columbus' copy is filled with the sailors' marginalia. Now remember, we think in Asia, we're talking about lingo from this time. When they said Asia, guys, remember there was Asia Minor, Asia Major. What happened to Asia Major? Where's Greater Asia? That was North America, guys. So yeah, you can get to Asia Major or India Superior through the Atlantic. You guys get it? The myth that surrounds Columbus claims that he was among the first to believe that the world was round. That's the Haja with their spinning balls and all that. Even in a flat earth, it's still probably round. Others feared sailing west for fear of falling off the edge of flat earth. So you would get these crazy stories, but Again, guys, these people knew this is most likely added conjectures later on. Such tales are the product of modern childhood stories. See, modern, like I said, that was added later in grade school textbooks. You see, they added that later. Nobody ever said that from their time. Nobody primary source saying, "Oh, if we go over there, we're gonna fall off the edge." Nobody ever said that. They're literally telling you that right now. In truth, most educated people at the time knew Earth was round. Sailors were merely reluctant to sail west into a vast open Atlantic. Yet writers like D. Ali fixed Columbus' obsession to reach the Indies, Japan, and China by sailing west. All right, but what is the original Sipango, Shipango, Yepango? That was in the Americas, guys. China, remember China, the name is Sinai, Sinai, Sinao, Sinaola. Come on, Sinai. Come on. We have places like that named here. His fixation led to his discovery. In parentheses, right? Remember, he didn't discover anything. You can't discover a place, but there's already millions of people living. So how do you discover a place where there's already people? That doesn't make sense. Right? So when they tell you discovery in parentheses, it's subliminals on purpose. They know this truth. So that's what led him to come here, because he knew it was here, is what they mean. He knew about the Americas and the reinauguration of the Red Atlantic, crossing the Atlantic, because for some reason it was impassable for some point, at one point. Columbus' second obsession, less peculiar to himself, was gold. In a letter to Father Martinez, Paolo Toscanelli urged the priest to let the Portuguese king know how profitable an undertaking a voyage to Asia would be. Japan, he said, was rich in gold, as noted in the introduction. All right, Japan rich in gold, Sipango. We talking about Hispaniola. So is Japan known for being rich in gold? Not really like other countries, guys. We know that America's is. So remember, they didn't mean today's modern Japan. Just like when they talk about India, they're not talking about today's modern India, guys. Places have been replaced. Modern places have been named old places. Things like that. That's just what I'm trying to tell you. You got to make sense out of this. Where's the gold? Rich in gold? Really? Japan? Really? As noted in the introduction, one need only read Bartolomé de las Casas' brief accounts of the destruction of the Indians to get a sense of the place indigenous gold held in the minds of later Spanish explorers and conquistadors, right? So this author is subliminally trying to make you think. He's trying to say, hey, but where's the true Gold Coast? And what happened when they got here? And what did they do with the gold? And how greedy they got and what they did to the Indians for this gold, right? So was they really talking about modern day Japan when they're saying Sipango? Because that's what Columbus called it. He didn't call it Japan, he called it Sipango. And if you look at very old maps of the Americas, you'll see Sipango right in the Americas, guys. All came in search of the wealth of the Americas, all right? The wealth of the true old world, all the resources, all the food, the wealth, paradise, terrestrial paradise, right? For Columbus, there was a special urgency. Why was there an urgency for Columbus and his crew? Because they were crypto Jews that were getting kicked out of Spain and Europe and Portugal and all that. That's why there was an urgency to look good for the Catholics, to provide and make himself rich as well for his people. It says, in exchange for the Catholic monarch's investment and his enterprise, the mariner had promised them riches beyond measure. In return, they had promised him 10% of the wealth brought from Asia along his new route, not only by himself, but by anyone, and not only in his lifetime, but to his heirs for all future time. Some obsession is understandable. Wow. You see that? So look what they're calling it in the records. They're calling America's Asia, guys. Come on now. Come on now. On October 12, 1492, Columbus set his first dry foot on Western Hemisphere land on what is today commonly assumed to be Watlin's Island in the Bahamas. Yeah, that's where he landed, guys. Where he encountered a lot of Lucayans and Taino people and Carib people, and enslaved them. Columbus' original log of that first voyage was lost. What we have is an abstract of it produced by Las Casas some 40 years after the admiral's death. So this is very controversial regarding Columbus, if he was actually a a real person? Or was it just, like the guy I mentioned, Fernando Salvador Sarco, and he's just not mentioned? Because his actual first log is missing. The first voyage and a lot of the voyages we're getting it from third or other persons. Even if they're like from his time, we're getting it secondhand sources. So we got to trust De Las Casas. We got to trust, everybody else that wrote about him. Okay. In that document, commonly called the Journal of the First Voyage to America, so this is the one that Las Casas wrote 40 years after Columbus died. The narrator is sometimes Las Casas and sometimes Columbus himself, whom Las Casas quotes. We also have a letter that Columbus wrote reporting on his journey after his arrival at Lisbon in March 1493. So there is kind of some letters here by Columbus supposedly. Stepping ashore, Columbus called the men in his landing party together to bear witness that he, before all others, took possession, as in fact he did, of that island for the king and queen, his sovereigns, making the requisite declarations. Remember, they write out this thing to the Indians that the Indians didn't even understand, you know, and they're like, "Hey, we're gonna take your land in the name of the king. You can't fight us back, or else you'll be enslaved. Don't fight us, or you will become prisoners of war." Blah 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 blah. They didn't even know what they were saying, supposedly, right? It says in his letter addressed to the royal treasurer Luis de Santangel. Now, this is the guy who really financed his voyages, guys. Not the king and queen from Spain. They just allowed it. They just sanctioned it. But this is the guy who actually financed him, and he was a crypto Jew, Portuguese Sephardic Jew, Luis de Santangel. We got videos on this, guys. Columbus himself describes the incident, and others like it. So remember, he's writing to Luis Santangel instead of the Queen in Spain first. He wrote to him first. He was the first person that Columbus wrote back to, not even the King and Queen, because this is the real guy who made it happen for him, who financed him, who gave him the ships and everything. And Columbus says to him, "I came to the Indian Sea." You see, he's calling America Indian, "where I found many islands inhabited by men without number, all of which I took possession for our most fortunate king, with proclaiming heralds and flying standards, no one objecting." He named the place San Salvador for the Holy Savior. Seemingly conveniently for Columbus, as he was completing his legalistic rituals of discovery, according to Las Casas, numbers of the people on the island straightway collected together. Of the encounter, the admiral declared, "As I saw that they were very friendly to us, and perceived that they could be much more easily converted to our holy faith by gentle means than by force, I presented them with some red caps and strings of beads to wear upon the neck, and many other trifles of small value, wherewith they were much delighted, and became wonderfully attached to us." So he tricked them with, like little combs and mirrors and whatever they thought, because they never saw valuable, and they took their land and converted them, right? Supposedly, right? Remember, this was his first voyage. His second voyage was a lot different. They came to conquer and kill and murder. Conquest. That was the first one was a reconnaissance spy mission. The second and the third and fourth, they were all just to, conquer, enslave, and take over, possess the land. The people who gathered around Columbus on the beach, as he claimed their land for the Spanish crown, were the Taino, who called the island Guanahani. All right, that's what they called it, the Bahamas, that part of the Bahamas. By the time they set eyes on the Spanish seamen, they were themselves old hands at plying the Atlantic. So what did they say? The Taino already seafarers in the Atlantic. All right, by the time the Europeans arrived there, the Taino are also called the island Arawak, to both relate them to and distinguish them from the Arawak who reside in northeastern South America. Sometime around 500 BC, archaic Taino, the ancestors of those who Columbus would meet, split off from their non-seafaring Arawak relatives and set forth on the Caribbean. So, admittingly, right, they know that the Arawaks got to the island somehow. They used the boat, right, from South America. So, what would limit people to stop in just little islands? Wouldn't they keep exploring the whole world once they're seafaring? Think about that, guys. Like, really, really think about that. So, split up from their nuns. Okay, so by 900 CE, they occupied the greater Antilles island of Cuba, Hispaniola, present day Haiti, and the Dominican Republic, Jamaica, and Puerto Rico, and the southern part of Bahamas. All right, the Arawak or so-called Taino. I think they became Taino when they mixed with the other people that were locally from these islands and from the mainland, North America and Central America, Mayas and all that. That's even people from the mound builders, coming down. That's what I think created the whole distinction between the Arawaks of South America and the ones that became known as Taino. Okay, that's my theory. It just makes more sense. They routinely used their large dugout canoes to travel between islands, right? They were seafaring. There is no record of what Columbus said to the curious Indians who crowded around him on that beach on Guanahani. An educated guess, however, is that the first confusing words the indigenes heard this Portuguese black man, a Sephardic Jew, utter were "Salam alaikum." All right, what did Columbus say to them? "Salam alaikum," huh? Huh? Isn't that a Muslim term? Arab term? Is it? So he's a Sephardic Moorish person, huh? Salam alaikum, huh? The standard Muslim greeting, translated as "peace be upon you." Arabic, the language of that salutation, was the lingua franca of commerce at that time. What? What was the mother tongue or main language used for navigators? Arabic, guys. You guys hear that? Not English, not Spanish, not Portuguese. Okay? And almost anyone engaged in trade and commerce would speak at least some of it. The admiral's interpreter was fluent, and Columbus himself assumed he had reached Asia where he would be addressing merchants. Salam alaikum. Peace be upon you. So that's a major drop right there. First of all, when they talk about his interpreter, they talk about Luis de Torres. Luis de Torres spoke Hebrew. He spoke all the old world main languages, Chaldean, Arabic. On purpose, they brought him because they knew that he would be able to communicate with the people of the true old world who actually spoke the mother tongue where all these languages came out of, right? So they can somehow communicate. And Luis de Torres did communicate with them guys. And now the whole thing about him thinking he was in Asia and he was using Salam Alaikum, why would he be calling Asians or talking Arabic to Asians? Think about that. The truth is, guys, we got future videos is because, like those voyages of so-called Chinese coming, those were Arabs. Like Sun Sao, I believe his name, Sun Sao, one of the so-called Chinese navigators that came to the Americas, Fu Song, he was Muslim, he was Arab. A lot of these people were Arabs, Moors, or whatever you want to call them, Muslims. They were traveling the world, guys. They were seafaring, and they had reached the Pacific side from Europe, and then had crossed it to come to the Americas, right? So this is literally telling you straight up who was in China at the time. What was the main language there? All right. Whatever the form and substance of Columbus' address to what must have been confused indigenes, at that moment of first contact, he reestablished the Red Atlantic, first commenced far to the north by the Vikings' arrival. He also initiated a delicate minuet, a dance in which European and indigenous partners came together and then moved apart amid demand and coercion on one hand and resistance on the other. It was a dance in which the participants put distance between themselves, but never entirely detached and separated, as much as the indigenes might have wished to do so. Columbus wrote, I was very attentive to them, and strove to learn if they had any gold. Seeing some of them with little bits of this metal hanging at their noses, I gathered from them by signs that by going southward or staring round the island in that direction, there would be found a king who possessed large vessels of gold, and in great quantities. I endeavored to procure them to lead the way thither, but found they were unacquainted with the route. Here, without ever having seen another European and with communication with the ones before them, limited to gestures, the Taino developed what would become a routine stratagem. In the face of avaricious demands by Spaniards for gold, natives simply pointed them farther north down the line. Sorry, pointed them farther down the line, not north. Oh, you want gold? The Indians said. You know who has gobs of gold? That king over there. Just keep moving this way to the gold. Columbus, for his part, was quicker than most to catch on to the ruse. On October 15th, he wrote in his journal, about sunset, we anchored near the cape which terminates the island toward the west, to inquire for gold. For the natives we had taken from San Salvador told me that the people here wore golden bracelets upon their arms and legs. I believed pretty confidently that they had invented this story in order to escape from us. Still, I determined to pass none of these islands without taking possession, because being once taken, it would answer for all times. You see, enslaving the people, taking their land, right? Although Columbus' obsession with gold remained largely unsated, it would endure as a major theme throughout the first voyage. In the portion of the journal entry from October 15th quoted above, however, the natives we had taken from San Salvador, I believe pretty confidently that they had invented the story in order to escape from us. Yet another of his obsessions is revealed: slavery. Slavery. American slaves, not African slavery. They sugarcoat this in history and mainstream narrative. They don't tell us how extensive it was, how this was the mission: enslave Indians, not Africans. Biographer Kirkpatrick Sale, in his The Conquest of Paradise, Christopher Columbus and the Columbian Legacy, knows that it is unknown whether slavery was in Columbus' mind from the start of his enterprise, as his other two obsessions unquestionably were. Yet once in the Indies, he seized upon the notion immediately. In his journal entry for October 12th, the very date he first met the Taino, he offered the following assessment: it appears to me that the people are ingenious and would be good servants, and I am of the opinion that they would be very readily become Christians, as they appear to have no religion. They very quickly learn such words as are spoken to them. If it please our Lord, I intend at my return to carry home 6 of them to your highnesses, that they may learn our language. Sale states, it may fairly be called the birth of American slavery. All right, so remember, Columbus, this is one of his famous quotes that people quote. He admitted that the Indians are easy to enslave and be held captive and be taken, and that they can easily be converted to become Christians. All right, he said that. Once he said that, it became official. All right, let's enslave them. Right, let's enslave them. The birth of American slavery, modern times, right, and European colonial times. Columbus said that should the monarchs wish it, the entire populace could be shipped to Castile or enslaved in situ to work on the island. He wrote, I could conquer the whole of them with 50 men and govern them as I pleased. All right. Listen to what he's saying, guys. Come on. This is what I'm saying. So, slavery started with American Indians, now with Africans in 1619. Those ain't even Africans. We already debunked that. And those weren't the first so called Negroes in the Americas. We debunked all that, recently. Not only that, he's saying, hey, we can enslave all of them. He's telling the king and queen, we can enslave all of them. And they're mad easy to enslave. I could, use 50 men. I could take the whole island. Literally, that's what he was saying. Literally. So by the time he went back, he came back on his second voyage, right? That was the plan, guys. Right? They're not saying, hey, king and queen, let's go to Africa and I can take them all. I can take them all for you. They never said none. There's no primary sources ever saying none of that, guys. The primary sources are telling you who they're taking, and I've shown you in my Real Slave Trade of America series playlist. But we're probably going to mention a lot of that today in this book, in this chapter. That's what it's about, right? As you guys can see, he said we can enslave them or even put them to work on the island, local labor, so they didn't have to bring no Africans. They're telling you right here, I can conquer the whole of them with 50 men and do whatever I please. As the Vikings had done in kidnapping Waltoff and Vimar, Columbus immediately began nabbing Tainos and detaining them aboard his ships, all right? Slave expeditions, just like they said they were doing in West Africa. That's what they were doing in the Caribbean. As soon as they got here, nabbing Indians, detaining them aboard the ships, right? Deuteronomy 28 ships, right? Columbus used them in the first instance as guides to sources of the gold he so fervently sought. Also, like the Norse, though he desired to bring his captives back to the homeland for language instruction. In the report made upon his return, he wrote, as soon as I reached that sea, the Caribbean, I seized by force several Indians on the first island. As soon as he got there, he made slaves out of the people. The very first island he landed on, right? In order that they might learn from us, and in like manner tell us about those things and these lands of which they themselves had knowledge. And the plan succeeded. For in a short time we understood them, and they us, sometimes by gestures and signs, sometimes by words. I'm telling you, they was talking to them using old world languages. And it was a great advantage to us. They are coming with me now. They're coming back with me. Get the soldier, get the plantations ready, get everything. We got slaves, man. In his journal, Columbus refers to 6 such captives accompanying him. Elsewhere in the same document, he refers to 7. Both numbers are post-diction, as opposed to prediction, calculated and written after the fact. Columbus did take 6 Indian captives with him when he met with Ferdinand and Isabella. These, however, were only the survivors. All right? That was only the ones that survived. He brought a lot more with him. We read before that Columbus brought Columbus alone up to like 3,600 Indians as slaves to Europe and to Cape Verde Islands. All right? Columbus alone. So these were the survivors. That's why they're saying only 6 he took, right? They're trying to sugarcoat the numbers. Columbus and his captains seized many more captives. Perhaps the most callous incident of kidnapping is described by Columbus in his journal entry for November 12. All right, primary source. We've probably read this already in other older videos. And he said, yesterday, a canoe came to the ship with 6 young men. 5 of them came on board, whom I ordered detained and have them with me. I then sent ashore to one of the houses and took 7 women and 3 children. This I did that the Indians might tolerate their captivity better with their company. All right? You see what he's doing? Breaking up families, committing atrocities, enslaving women, children. Why were they doing all this? You know? And he thought he was in a holy mission because he reached the Holy Land. Literally, they found the Holy Land again. He wrote that. So, continues, says, besides, these women will be a great help to us in acquiring their language, which is the same throughout all these countries. The inhabitants keeping up a communication among the islands by means of their canoes. This evening came on board the husband of one of the women and father of the 3 children, which were a boy and 2 girls. He entreated me to let him accompany them, which I very willingly granted. The natives whom I had taken from here were all so delighted as to induce me to think them his relations. Huh. They were excited because they were with their family. They didn't get separated, but he didn't want to be enslaved and taken to another location. What human is going to be excited about that? By force, right? Kidnapped. Columbus evokes the experience of the Portuguese with slaves they had taken from Guinea and Africa. All right. What? Where's the source for that? Look, guys, there's no footnote. See how he has footnotes throughout the book? Where's the footnote for that? Remember that in the Guinea and Africa, or the coast of Guinea and Africa, a lot of the times just meant Cape Verde or the Azores. They didn't go to the mainland. There is no, show me the primary source. Show me what Portuguese that Columbus said, because he never said that. They didn't quote that. I've read a lot of Columbus journal. He never said nothing about anybody going to Africa to get slaves. There's no source for that. Okay. Now it says Columbus arrived in Portugal March 4, 1493, with 10 captive indigenes. The following day, an official arrived under armed escort and instructed him that he must accompany them to give an accounting to the stewards of King Jao. Remember King Jao? He's the knight of the Order of Santiago from that video I did where I showed that painting in Portugal, Lisbon. And King Jao is the guy on the horse. He's the black man. King Jao is the knight of the Order of Santiago. So this same King Jao is who they're talking about here. So Columbus replied that he would comply only under force. He served the king and queen of Castile, and it was the custom of Castilian admirals rather to die than deliver up either themselves or their men. The Portuguese relented, and after examining Columbus' letters from the Catholic monarchs, they withdrew. By March 6, news of Columbus and his curious cargo's arrival had spread, and there came a vast multitude from the city to visit him and see the Indians. The throng of gawkers continued unabated the following day. Among the crowd were two royal stewards. On March 8th, Columbus received a letter from King Jao asking that the admiral visit him at Val do Paraíso, a monastery about 25 miles northeast of Lisbon. Columbus arrived at the royal court on March 9th, bringing with him several of the Indians. These captives thus became the first Western Hemisphere indigenes ever presented to a European ruler. Now, we know that there's a hijack because we literally read today that the Vikings did the same, or that Indians, showed up in the shores of ancient Rome, and they presented them to their rulers. So they're not the first, right? Anyways, they mean in Columbus' time after the 1492 conquest, right? So according to the accounts of King Joe, was startled by their nakedness, yet impressed by their intelligence. There's an actual source for that, you see? So where's the source for the African slaves of the Guinea coast? None. You see, there's no source right here. So there's an actual source of him saying that King Jao, he did meet Indians. The king's purpose and request from the audience was not, however, to inspect Columbus' exotic specimens. It was rather to inform the mariner that, pursuant to the Treaty of Alcacovas, which Jao had signed with Ferdinand and Isabella in 1479, all the lands Columbus had claimed belonged to Portugal. For his part, Columbus responded that he knew nothing of the treaty, but in any event, he had not visited Africa, but the Indies. All right? He didn't go to Africa. There you go. But the Indies. Indies. Remember that India wasn't even named India. So where are they getting this Indies from? India got named in the 1940s. It was called Hindustan. So again, there was more than one India, guys, in medieval times and in colonial times and Columbus time. They weren't lost. On March 11, as Columbus took his leave, the king gave him a letter for the Catholic monarchs. On the way back to his ship, the admiral stopped at the monastery of St. Anthony to pay his respects to the Portuguese queen. At her request, he raised anchor on March 13th. 2 days later, Columbus arrived back in Palos de la Frontera, the port from whence he had set sail for the Indies. He then proceeded to Seville. There he received a letter from the king and queen addressed to Don Cristobal Colon, Admiral of the Ocean Sea, Viceroy and Governor of the islands he has discovered in the Indies. Among those who were there to see Columbus was Bartolomé de las Casas. In time, he would play a major role in the Red Atlantic as a leader of the so-called indigenista movement of Spaniards who sought fair treatment of the indigenous peoples of the Americas. But that day in Seville, he was a mere child, a boy of 9. On that day, young Bartolomé glimpsed his first Indians. He later recalls seeing 7 of them. They had been put alongside the Arch of the Images at San Nicolas. Las Casas biographer Gustavo Gutierrez writes of the scene and the thoughts it must have conjured in the boy's mind. So this is from a primary source at that time. Says, at that tender age, then he saw for the first time, with innocent curiosity and astonishment, those to whom and this time it was they who would be astonished. He would later devote his life. There would be no point in our trying to penetrate what went through this child's head at the sight he beheld at the arch of the images. But we may surely think that the grown man recounting this scene is rereading that first experience, and in retrospect feels that it was by God's will that it occurred symbolically in his native city, with which he would always feel such close ties. The friar from Seville is fully aware of the crucial role of personal experience and will refer to it 1,000 ways all his life long. Later in November 1493, the boy's father, Pedro de las Casas, and three of his uncles would ship out with Columbus on his second voyage to the Indies. The results of that second voyage would make him even more lasting will make an even more lasting impression on the boy. But at this moment he was merely another gawker, but an extra in the unfolding drama. Columbus left four of the Indians in Seville, almost certainly due to critically ill health. Had they been able to travel, Columbus would have been deeply desirous that they accompany him to court. Nothing more is reported of them, and they no doubt expired from some European disease to which they had no immunity. That's a conjecture, guys. They could have survived, had kids, mixed in with the people, as would so many other indigenous who would travel the Red Atlantic. The admiral took the surviving six with him on the 800-mile journey to Barcelona, where the Spanish court was sitting at the time. Columbus was eager to give the king and queen an account of his voyage and justify himself in the face of the opposition of so many of the principal persons of the monarch's household, who were all against me and ridiculed my project. According to Columbus' illegitimate son Fernando, in his 1538 work, The Life of Admiral Christopher Columbus, also written partly by Las Casas, everyone came from everywhere to gaze at him and at the Indians and other strange objects that he brought with him. One cannot help but notice the casual colonialist equation of the indigenes with other strange objects, parrots, exotic species of flora, and so forth. Unfortunately, similar comparisons became all too common in the process of conquest and colonization. Europeans often saw and depicted Western Hemispheric indigenes as merely part of the natural environment, like plants and animals, and thus less than human. Once the group reached the royal court, the Catholic monarchs arranged and witnessed the first ritual event of its kind, the religious conversion of Indians to the Christian faith. According to Vaughan, in an elegant and poignant ceremony, 6 Indians received baptism and prestigious new names, among them Fernando de Aragon, Don Juan de Castilla, and Don Diego Colon. The Spanish king, queen, and young prince served as godparents. Do you guys see? Don Diego Colon, wasn't that a son of Columbus, supposedly? Could that have been the Indian? Huh. You see how they gave him all these names? Like Fernando de Aragon? Newly, newly named Don Juan de Castilla, that's one of the Indians, guys, right? Would attend the royal family for the remaining 2 years of his life as evidence of Columbus' navigational achievement and the natives' adaptability to Spanish customs. As the Vikings undoubtedly intended for the Beothuk boys Walthoff and Vimard, and as the admiral explicitly stated in his journal of his first voyage, language instruction was a principal reason for bringing natives to Spain so that they might serve as interpreters on future expeditions. The first native sacrament of baptism that the royals observed in 1493 would be replicated many times over in the years to come. To again quote Vaughan, many subsequent Indian captives who survived the Atlantic crossing and the onslaught of European pathogens learned the Castilian language, converted to Catholicism, imparted information about their homelands, and returned to America as quasi Spaniards. A new class, indeed a new caste, was born. It is important to note that not all transatlantic natives came as captives. Some came willingly. In 1502, Ferdinand and Isabella issued a decree that any who wanted to come, learn Spanish, and return home should be brought over. Two of the original surviving six Colombian captives were returned with the admiral on his second voyage in September 1493, serving as interpreters. So, why would they willingly come back and help them conquer the rest of the people? They were probably forced to come back as well, because that's what they did on their second voyage. It was conquest and enslavement. This second voyage was very different in a number of ways from the first, just 1 year earlier. Instead of two small caravels, and now the admiral of the ocean sea now led a veritable fleet of no less than 17 ships. You guys hear that? They don't tell us about this in school. They only want us to think about three: the Pinta, the Santa Maria, and whatever. So the 17, these are warships too, carrying 1,200 to 1,500 men. The second major difference was the relative ease of the passage. The ships got underway on September 24 and sailed first to the Canary Islands off the coast of Africa. You see how they say the Canary Islands is off the coast of Africa or Guinea? Canary Islands is mad far. And this is what I've been trying to tell you guys. They be calling the Canary Islands, the Azores, and Cape Verde the coast of Africa or Guinea. And there was mad Indians there that they were really taking. They weighed anchor there on October 13th and arrived at the island of Dominica in the Lesser Antilles on November 3rd. As Hans Koenig states, the easy voyage makes one wonder why it had not been done long before. The answer is obvious, of course, and Koenig himself provides the writing. Geographically, no other crossing matched the first one. The mystery barrier had been broken. The Red Atlantic had been opened up. A third crucial difference was the reception and reaction of the indigenous people. Their main acts of resistance during the first voyage were what might be considered passive, attempting to meet Spanish demands for gold by simply pointing them down the line to other islands. By now, news of the Spaniards' activities had spread throughout the islands, and their inhabitants employed strategies that they had begun to use increasingly by the end of Columbus' first voyage. Repeatedly, Columbus found abandoned villages upon his arrival. The indigenes fled at his approach. But physical violence was yet another response. When Columbus had departed for Spain on the first voyage, he left behind 39 men to garrison a fort, which he named La Navidad on his Peñola. So we've read about this a lot. And when he came back, they were gone. They were dead. They had fled. They were almost dying. He returned on November 27, 1493, expecting to see a thriving settlement. He found instead corpses littering the beach and the colony destroyed. Through his captive Taino interpreters, local Indians told Columbus that after his departure, the men of La Navidad had rampaged over the island, searching for gold, taking captives, raping women and boys. Oh man, that's dirty. Listen, guys, raping women and boys, pedophiles. Boys? Come on now, guys, look. Finally, the people whom the admiral had viewed as innocent, peaceful, inoffensive, long ago relieved of their innocence, retaliated. No member of the garrison survived. Other violent clashes were to follow, all right? A final related critical difference between Columbus' first and second voyages was the actions of the Spaniards themselves. This last is a difference not so much in fundamental character as in what might be called volume. Columbus was under pressure to show some tangible return on the investment of his royal patrons. Since gold had not materialized in promised quantities, another commodity had to be found. On his second voyage, Columbus became a serious slaver. What happened on the second voyage? See, this is the excuse they use of why they started enslaving Indians, but that was the plan from the beginning, guys. He wrote about it in the first voyage, right? But he already knew he was coming to do that. So they try to say, oh, they didn't find gold, so they started enslaving. No, that was always the plan. Columbus became a serious slaver, slave captive. Yeah, and massive slave raids Spaniards rounded up to 1,600 men, women, and children to fill the holds of supply ships returning to Spain and placed them in open pens at the new Spanish settlement of Isabella, named for the Spanish queen. Because the returning vessels could hold only around 500 slaves as cargo, only the best were selected for transport. Spaniards and Hispaniola were permitted to select from the remainder. Those not chosen, numbering about 400, were simply considered something like army surplus and summarily released. According to Michel de Cuneo, we got his quote how they 800,000, like, no, I think he quoted millions of Indian slaves, you know, made captive, right? An Italian nobleman on the voyage who described the pitiable scene. Listen to what he said, a part of it. It says, they rushed in all directions like lunatics. Women dropping and abandoning infants in the rush, running for miles without stopping, fleeing across mountains and rivers. These terrified indigenes were the lucky ones. And that's a very sugar coated quote from Cuneo. He actually describes a very horrific scene of people being murdered, enslaved, millions of them, and people being raped, a woman specifically being tied up and raped. Like, yeah, this was bad. By the time the ships dropped anchor, oh, sorry, the 550 Indians selected for shipment were loaded into the departing ships. By the time the ships dropped anchor in Cadiz, right, in Spain, 200 had died. You guys hear that? Only 300 made it, 200 died on the way, a middle passage, right? But they want us to think about only Africans, right? They want to give us false narratives, and we victimize the wrong people. When it happened to all different people, we don't victimize, right? So 200 had died on the way, their bodies simply thrown overboard, right? That's what they said they did to Africans, right? But it was actually to American Indians and the Europeans that were doing that too. Half of the remainder were sick. Cuneo attributed to the unaccustomed air colder than theirs. Cuneo concluded that they are not working people, and they very much fear cold, nor have they long life. Most of the survivors, including the seriously ill, were put up for sale in Seville. Only a handful survived. One of those who did survive was a Taino boy whom they called Juanico, Little Juan. Pedro de las Casas gave him a present to his son Bartolome. The gift has been described variously as one of a companion, a servant, even a pet. Regardless of how he has been characterized, he was by any definition a captive and a slave. Queen Isabella was reportedly enraged that her Indian subjects were being enslaved. After judicial proceedings by royal decree, the surviving natives were ordered released and returned to their homeland. Among those who set sail in June 1500 was Juanico. The high mortality rates rendered the slave trade unprofitable, and Columbus focused again on gold. Nevertheless, he wrote, let us, in the name of the Holy Trinity, go on sending all the slaves that can be sold. All right? They still kept doing it. As many as they can. As many as they can sell, right? Indians, not Africans. Slavery and lust for gold would shortly come together in a very important way, with major repercussions for the Red Atlantic. Isabella's horror at having her native subjects enslaved led the Catholic monarchs to order a halt to the importation of indigenes purely for the purposes of slavery. The church also worried about the effect of the practice on potential converts, yet, as Vaughan notes, the monarchs' rules were sometimes laxly enforced, and there were major exceptions. All right? Slavery was permissible as a punishment for resisting Spanish occupation, for rebellion against Spanish authority, and for actions deemed criminal in Spanish law. So basically, even though they had this fake law that you couldn't enslave Indians, they made up excuses to be able to go around that. Oh no, that's because they fought us. These are prisoners of war. These are rebels, and a lot of them weren't. A lot of them never fought back. A lot of them were women and children, old men. They were just enslaving them and creating excuses, guys. Columbus and others on his second voyage became convinced, or rather, convinced themselves, despite a total lack of evidence, that the Caribs of the Eastern Caribbean were cannibals. You see, that's the hijack. They got all labeled cannibals, all the Caribs. The word cannibal, they try to say relates to It meant something else in the Carib language, guys. And in 1494, the admiral asked the crown for permission to capture Caribs for shipment to Spain, describing them as a people so fierce, healthy, well proportioned, and intelligent that once rid of that inhumanity, they would make better slaves than any others. Who? Who? And remember, the Caribs, these are black folk, these are so called Negroes of the land, right? Negroes. They would make what? The best slaves than any other, including Africans, than any other. These are your slaves. They well proportioned. They work hard. Yeah. Oh, there's a different type of Indian right here. Oh yeah, he can be enslaved. The monarchs decided, however, that that was an insufficient reason to enslave the Carib, a position that Isabella would resign in 1503. They changed their mind in 1503. Ferdinand and Isabella's abjuration of slavery applied only to shipments of slaves to Spain. In the New World, Columbus required Indians, men and women, to produce a fixed amount of gold every 3 months. The results were meager. When this system of forced labor proved unworkable in 1496, Columbus instituted on Hispaniola a prototype for the encomienda system. An encomienda was the grant of a specific tract of land to a Spaniard, the encomendero, as an estate or plantation. It's the same thing, bro. Guys, the slavery and indentured servitude. The encomendero was entitled to collect tribute or require labor from the natives within his entrusted territory. Though there were supposed formal safeguards in practice, it differed little from outright slavery. Okay? It's the same thing. It is slavery. The system was eventually introduced throughout Ibero-America, okay? And then in literally to North America. So they did that everywhere, guys. Everywhere they went in the Americas, enslaving, creating plantations with Indians and encomiendas, not Africans, guys. In March 1496, Columbus set sail for Spain. With him, he took 36 more slaves. Spain would outlaw Indian slavery in the middle of the next century, but before that happened, Spaniards enslaved tens of thousands of natives. And even when they outlawed it, they kept doing it. So even more. So tens of thousands, man. Most of these were kept in situ, where they were worked to death, meaning locally. In Guatemala, for instance, the Spanish had a saying, "Who needs horses when you have Indians?" Wow. Meaning that they made the Indians carry them. Even so, thousands of Western Hemisphere indigenes would see slavery in Spain. Many more died in transit, okay? This was the reality, guys. This is a real slave trade. This is what they sugarcoat to us. They don't want to give us the numbers, the real numbers, and then they want to make up numbers of Africans. It's messed up, you know. Continue. It says Christopher Columbus would make two more voyages to the New World, gold and slaves being prominent motives in both. But it was the first two trips that established the critical patterns for all the subsequently for all that subsequently transpired. According to historian Felipe Fernandez Armesto, between them, Columbus' ocean crossings of 1492 to 93 established the most practical and exploitable routes back and forth across the Atlantic, linking the densely populated belt of the Old World. All right, but that's the New World, really, which stretched from China across southern and southwestern Asia to span the Mediterranean, with the threshold of the richest and most populous regions of the New World. By the close of the 15th century, less than 8 years after Columbus set foot on Guanahani, remember the Bahamas, Europeans had made landfalls from Newfoundland to Brazil. The actions of the admiral also most crucially created the whole full template for European interaction with the indigenous peoples of the Americas, meaning they all did the same thing: conquer and enslave the Indians. Subsequent explorers and other sailors routinely followed his practice of kidnapping and enslaving natives. Despite the black legend of Spanish cruelty, which, as we will see in Chapter 5, Las Casas inadvertently did much to create, no country's adventurers were immune. Among the notable explorers who captured natives in the late 15th and early 16th centuries were the Portuguese Gaspar Corte Real and Sebastian Cabot. So you guys thought Sebastian Cabot was English, right, or French, right? He was Portuguese. He had he had kind of Frenchized or anglicized his name. There was a different version of his name, Cabot. So these two famous, navigators, explorers were literally slave raiders, right? They were slavers sailing for England, and Giovanni de Verrazzano. Okay, these were all slavers, and Jacques Cartier. These were all slavers, guys. But we read about them in history as heroes, as explorers, navigators. These are cruel, cruel people and slavers, right? Both in the service of Francis I of France. So those last two. And while Sir Walter Raleigh was imprisoned in the Tower of London by King James I from 1603 until 1616, he was sometimes served by natives from Trinidad or Guyana. Wow. That's crazy because Walter Raleigh eventually went to Cape Verde and picked up American Indian slaves and brought them to the Americas, and also enslaved other Indians in the Americas. So he already had met Indians while he was in captive by the Catholics, King James, because he was a Protestant. Remember, there's a whole inner beef going on, black on black. It's not white versus black. Don't think like that. But he already had met Indians in jail, so he's like, I can make my own servants, just like these guys. Regarding Spain in her book Indians Abroad, 1493 to 1938, Caroline Thomas Foreman says the Americo Vespucci, the man from whom the Americans take their name, dodged the hijack. We debunked that. His name is Albert. He did not name America. There was already an empire called the Amaracapana or Land Amaraca in South America and Amérique in Central America. Don't believe this. Go watch my videos. We debunked that. His name was Albert. Okay? Anyways, yeah, we read this book that they're talking about, Indians Abroad. And guess what? I read the introduction of this book on YouTube, and guess what? The lady, the author, took it down. They told me I can't read her book. YouTube said I can't read her book. I got a copyright and everything that I had for 3 months, which I had to wait out. And that video is on my Patreon. That's a really good video, guys. Really good. That introduction of that book was really good. That's why I read it. So go check it out on my Patreon page. They can't take it down from there. All right. So Caroline Thomas Foreman, right? That's the one who did that. So Vespucci on his first voyage in 1501 brought back 222 Indians to Cadiz. All right. Vespucci himself, a slaver, brought back 200 Indians as slaves, which he sold as slaves. Come on, guys. They're not growing in Africa. Their primary sources are saying something else. When are we going to wake up? So according to her, when Vespucci found friendly indigenes, better condition than those he had encountered previously, he determined to take a pair of men from this place, that they might teach them their language. And three of them volunteered to go to Portugal. Huh. Foreman's statement is based on questionable evidence, you see. Three of them volunteered, all right, sure. If the incident did occur, it would not have taken place in 1501, but as a result of the voyage of Alonso de Hojeda, whom Vespucci accompanied in 1499. That the account was at all credible speaks to the prevalence of such activities. Hojeda had sailed with Columbus on his second and third voyages and had participated with the admiral in slave raiding. Slave raiding, guys. They try to tell us, oh, they came to discover and conquest. They're sugarcoating it when they're saying that. They came to slave raid. They came to enslave the American Indians worldwide, send them worldwide, and use them locally. That was the major thing they did, really. This is what they sugarcoat in history. This is literally what they sugarcoat in history. All right, so we continue on page 51 to another part of the chapter 1. It says the destruction of a people. We'll probably read this one for the dismount because it's a long chapter, guys. We might do two parts. So it says, in Vine Deloria's 1971 revised edition of Jennings White's 1931, The Red Man in the New World drama, there is a fable. The author stated that at one time there was an annual gathering of men of letters at the inn of William the Conqueror at Dives-sur-Mer in Normandy. In that seaside setting, each participant took a turn telling his fellows an informative story. One of these ran as follows. A whaling vessel came upon an undiscovered Arctic island. About the crew, the unaffrighted penguins crowded with a show of confidence that appealed to the sympathies even of the rough seamen. The men conceived a great fondness for the dumb creatures who seemed almost human in their affection. Unfortunately, the ship's dog got loose in the night before the ship sailed and killed an entire brood of helpless young penguins. Bam. And remember, these Spanish dogs were these big, huge, crazy dogs, guys. I got a whole video on that. The next year, the sailors, longing to see their bird friends again, returned to the island. Not a penguin was seen until they were discovered in their distant hiding place. The dog had destroyed their trust. Fear had been born among them. Now they only desired to be let alone in their solitude. Man had nothing to offer them, which they prized as much as security. I am well aware, of course, that there are no penguins in the Arctic. So were Deloria and Weiss. The term penguin was often used, however, to refer to the great auk, now extinct, well before the discovery of the Antarctic species. The story is completely in keeping with how the bird was described in other accounts. As I said, what is offered is a fable, an apologue illustrating a simple moral point. The penguins are transparent stand-ins for natives. Oh wow! You see how they turned that story into a fable using penguins, but it was actually the story of them enslaving the native people and then losing their trust. After initially approaching the strange newcomers in a spirit of welcome and hospitality, they were victimized by the Europeans. Fear supplanted trust. The Beothuk were the first indigenous people in North America to encounter Europeans in the form of the Vikings. Some of them died. Others, like Valtov and Weimar, and perhaps others unknown to us, were captured and carried away to Iceland and Norway. And because the lords of history seem to have, by turns, first an ironic and then a tragic sense of humor, the Beothuk would get to repeat the process. Nearly 500 years after meeting the Norse, they would have the chance to be the first a second time. Remember, they were highly enslaved by the Portuguese and brought to places like Cape Verde. I mean, we got the videos, guys. The Beothuk occupied the island we know today as Newfoundland. Much of the year, they lived on the shore. They gathered shellfish along the beach. They fished and hunted sea mammals from their canoes. Those canoes were sturdy, and the Beothuk were highly skilled at handling them. According to anthropologist Aileen Macmillan, collecting birds' eggs was an important activity, for which expeditions were made as far away as Funk Island, a trip of about 65 kilometers across the rough North Atlantic. During the winter, they migrated inland, where they lived off caribou. Much of what we know about the Beothuk comes from accounts from the 18th and early 19th centuries. They, traditionally, may in fact have lived on the coastline year-round. Archaeological evidence suggests that moving to the interior of the island was a late pre-contact adaptation. It is even possible that such migrations may have been a response to European incursions. Given Beothuk behavior after renewed European contact, this seems probable. After the Columbus event, such contacts came early and often. Christopher Columbus was known by many names. The sailor from... all right, remember, he's not from Italy, all right, and that's not even his real name. So he would have been known, they're saying, as Cristoforo Colombo. Elsewhere in Italy, he was known as Christopher, but they're trying to say different variations in different countries, right? In Portugal, where he lived, all right, and worked for several years, because he was a Portuguese guy. He's from there. He's from a town called Cuba in Portugal. His name was Salvador Fernandes Sarco, Portuguese Jew, Sephardic Jew. All right, again, they're telling you he was living in Portugal. That's why. In Queen Isabel's Castile, he was called Cristobal Colon. In Catalan speaking Barcelona, he was Cristobal Colom. Christopher Columbus is an anglicization of his name in Latin, Christophorus Columbus. John Cabot, the mariner, who now enters our story of the Red Atlantic, shared much in common with the admiral of the ocean sea. Like Columbus, he was Italian. All right, remember the other guy was Portuguese, the Cabot, Sebastian Cabot, right? Remember, these people are crypto Jews, guys. They're not just English or Italians or, they're crypto Jews in reality. So, like Columbus is an Italian, right? No, not like Columbus, right? And just unlike Columbus, he's probably not Italian either. Probably goes back to Spain and Portugal. And he too was a man of many identities. A citizen of Venice, he signed himself Swan Chabotto. In Italian, he was called Giovanni Caboto. In Spain, where he appears to have fled to avoid his creditors, he was known as Juan Caboto and Johan Caboto. Monte Calunja, in Catalan-speaking Valencia, where he lived after fleeing Venice. Sometime probably in his 40s, he moved to Bristol, England, and became John Caboto, or simply John Cabot. See, that was later on that he got his name anglicized. He's probably Juan Caboto. And finally, like his contemporary, a fellow Italian sailor, he was a man of consummate ambition who found his greatest success sailing for a country other than his own. After news of Columbus' voyage reached England, Cabot petitioned King Henry the VII for permission to undertake a western voyage. In March 1496, the king responded by granting a patent to sail to all parts, regions, and coasts of the eastern, western, and northern sea under our banners, flags, and ensigns, with 5 ships or vessels of whatsoever burden and quality they may be, and with so many and with such mariners and men as they may wish to take with them in the said ships, at their own proper coats and charges, to find, discover, and investigate whatsoever islands, countries, regions, or provinces of heathens and infidels, and whatever or whatsoever part of the world placed, which before this time were unknown to all Christians. Cabot launched his first voyage of exploration from Bristol, apparently during the summer of 1496, with a single ship. According to a contemporary letter written by John Day, a London merchant living at the time in Bristol, to the great admiral of Spain, presumably Columbus. This expedition was cut short. His crew confused him. He was short of supplies and ran into bad weather, and he decided to turn back. Undeterred and better equipped and provisioned, and presumably with a less confusing crew, Cabot set sail from Bristol sometime in May 1497. 35 to 50 days later, on June 24th, Cabot and his crew made landfall in North America. Almost certainly. Almost certainly. In Newfoundland. That day, John Cabot became the first documented European since the Norse to set foot in North America. All right. So again, dodge the hijack. So they say documented, right? Not the first, but documented in their records, right? The scant documentary evidence and modern scholars generally agree that Cabot made no direct contact with indigenes on that second voyage. He did discover what appeared to be a deserted Beothuk camp on the beach. Why? Why weren't they there? There was a dead fire, a net, a needle for making nets, a carved wooden tool painted with a red ochre. Here goes the red ochre, with you get the red paint people. That is the base of the red paint seafaring people of the world, guys. The ancient red paint people. And we got a video on this. Right there in Newfoundland, they got an abundance of this red ochre. Right? It's a whole great investigation. I have a documentary up on my channel about it. So they found the red ochre and snares, presumably for birds or small game. A trail led from the campsite inland. It has been at least 150 years since the Vikings last sailed to Vinland. Did the Beothuk remember? Did they carry stories of those contacts in their oral tradition? Did they resort to the same tactic that Columbus encountered among the Taino, especially on his second voyage, and flee? Certainly they would employ this stratagem later on. Perhaps they had seen Portuguese or other sailors who are rumored to have preceded Cabot. This represented Cabot's only landfall on that voyage. He and his men stayed just long enough to inspect the site, take on fresh water, and claim the land for Henry VII. They penetrated the land no farther than the distance of a crossbow could shoot a bolt. Anthropologist and historian Peter Pope, in his book The Many Landfalls of John Cabot, writes that he feared contact given his small crew. The fact that he landed only once speaks volumes. After leaving this single landing, Cabot's ship did skirt the coast, taking in the landscape. It is possible that Cabot saw Botox at a distance through the trees. They would likely have wanted to monitor this visitor. At any rate, whether through Cabot or via those who would shortly come after him, the Botox became the original Red Indians. Huh. The designation had nothing to do with skin color. Yeah, right. Rather, the Botox, along with their neighbors, the Mi'kmaq and Innu, decorated their faces and bodies with the red ochre paint. But you see how they're admitting these are the red paint people? That was part of the tradition. They were seafarers. Of course, this is Greater Ireland. This is the true old world. People were going into the British Isles and all over the world seafaring from the Americas, right? That doesn't mean they didn't have copper colored, so-called red, copper colored complexions. These were swarthy people. Why? How do I know that? Because we got descriptions of the Botox. I have videos on this. I have descriptions of the Mi'kmaq and Innu at those times. Dark complexion people, swarthy, copper colored tribes of America. The Botox survived the incursions of the Vikings relatively unscathed. To be sure, there were armed clashes, and some like Valtov and Weimar, at least a few others, were carried away. There is no indication in the archaeological record, however, of a demographic collapse due to virgin soil plagues. Those European diseases against which Western Hemisphere indigenes were defenseless, or any other reason, such as occurred in the Caribbean in the wake of Columbus coming, and as would occur in many other places in the wake of contact and colonization. Their population seems to have come through relatively stable. Estimates for the number of Botox at the time of Cabot's voyage ranged from a few hundred to several thousand. This time, however, the Botox were not to be so fortunate. Cabot's arrival set in motion a chain of events that would devastate them. A moment ago, I said that the limited documentary testimony about Cabot's voyage supported the view that the explorer did not make direct contact with Indians on his expedition. There is, however, an exception. In his 1582 diverse voyages touching the discovery of America, the English writer Richard Halioke, a major early advocate of colonization of North America, quotes an unpublished and otherwise unknown section of the Chronicle of Robert Fabian, A History of England until Henry VII, published in 1515. Fabian died in 1513. So he died after they published after he died, The quoted passage details three Newfoundlanders brought to Henry's court by John Cabot. Three savage men, clothed in beast skins, ate raw meat, and spake such speech that not a man could understand them. So you see this other source from the 1500s saying John Cabot did meet Indians, did capture some and brought them back. So that whole story of him not meeting Indians or encountering them, that's a lie. Fabian, according to Halioke, then recounted that 2 years after, I saw two of the three apparelled after the manner of Englishmen, in Westminster Palace, which that time I could not discern from Englishmen. What? Oh man, that's a body bag right there. So first of all, the Indians became English, right? Like Englishmen. They dress like them and everything. So much that they look like them. Like how do you come on guys, think about that. How do you mistake, even if you're wearing their clothes, how would an Indian of America be mistaken for a so-called white Englishman, right? How would anybody confuse the two? Well, the reality is, guys, and this is proof right here, when primary sources are saying this, right? Halley-Oak from the 1500s is saying this. This is proof that they both kind of looked the same. They were swarthy. We know the Indians were swarthy, so the Europeans had to be swarthy too. So much alike that when they had each other's clothes on, you couldn't distinguish them. You couldn't distinguish them. That's from a primary source. You guys understand the implications of this. People try to, people don't really understand what they be reading when they read this stuff. Not because they're picturing white folks, they're picturing native, what a native's supposed to look like. And, oh, yeah, I guess they can look the same. Nah. So it says, although Halley-Oak's placement of the story of the acculturating powers of English civilization seems to indicate that Cabot was responsible. The incident referred to the 17th year of Henry's reign, making it 1502. That's exactly 1501, 1502 when Beothuk went, like they literally enslaved them and brought them wherever their colonies were, including Cape Verde. So that makes sense that he said that was probably in 1502, at least 3 years after the mariner disappeared during his third expedition to the New World. Yet what fired European imaginations about Cabot's discovery was neither a few pieces of Atlantic coastal material culture, a net needle, a wooden tool of unknown usage, nor three indigenous captives purportedly brought back to England. It was rather something else. The adventurer saw on his voyage fish. John Day told the Spanish admiral, all along this coast they found many fish, like those which in Iceland are dried in the open and sold in England and other countries, and called in English stockfish. All right, mad fish, abundance, true old world. That is to say, cod. Right, stockfish is saltfish, is codfish. Cape Cod, right? Cod. That's very popular in New England. Cabot himself reported that the Atlantic was swarming with fish, which can be taken not only with a net, but in baskets let down with a stone. Such an overly abundant resource, all right, a terrestrial paradise, right? Abundant resource could not go unexploited and would inevitably attract an avaricious element eager to profit. Just as Ibero-America drew not the flower of Spanish society, but those so greedy for yellow wealth that Indians would think gold their god, indigenes, especially the Beothuk, would bear the brunt of the assault. Huh. As I alluded above, there are unsubstantiated and discredited rumors of English or Portuguese sailors or fishermen reaching what is today the North Canadian coast prior to Cabot. And this is what I'm saying, guys. The Portuguese were already there enslaving all these Indians, bringing them to Cape Verde and all that. Europe, Portugal. So they're saying dating back to perhaps 1492. And of course, there are widely speculated stories of other earlier still. It seems incredible that if such a rich resource had been discovered, it would or could have been kept secret. Almost immediately in Cabot's wake, fishermen from Portugal, Spain, and France, as well as England, moved to exploit the Newfoundland cod fishery. If gold brought Spaniards to the Caribbean and what became known as Latin America, uh, fish lured Europeans to North America. You see that? Like, wow, resources, guys. Not just gold, but look, now they're going after the fish. And that also what happened because the Indians were right next to these fish, they ended up enslaving the Indians. Though Cabot claimed this Newfoundland for Henry VII of England, the fishery was utilized in the early years more by Bretons, Normans, Basques, and Portuguese than by Englishmen until 1560s. By 1504, seasonal fish stations were likely being established onshore. Some of these may have been inhabited year round. Thus, fish also dictated the earliest European building and settlement patterns. In each instance, the reaction of the Beothuk was to try to avoid the newcomers and withdraw into the interior. In 1500, Gaspar Corte Real received a commission from King Manuel I of Portugal to find the northwest passage to Asia. On his first voyage in that year, Cortes Real reached Greenland but did not land, and he was forced to turn back, probably by ice. The following year, he embarked with three caravels on his second voyage. This time, he reached Newfoundland, where he found a broken Italian sword and a pair of Venetian earrings, apparently evidence of John Cabot's lost third voyage. He also sees 57 Beothuk captives, okay? Slaves, not Africans, Indians. Cortes Real sent the captives and two of his ships back to Portugal, Middle Passage, right? Under the command of his brother Miguel. He was last seen sailing south. His exact fate is unknown. The fate of the Indians, however, is more certain. They were sold as slaves to defray the costs of the expedition. As fishing became increasingly common along the Newfoundland shore, although the Beothuk attempted to remain reclusive, both contact and conflict escalated between them and the Europeans. By 1506, only 9 years after Cabot's first landfall, the fishery had enlarged to the point where the Portuguese crown was taxing it, and Beothuk slaves were showing up in European markets with increasing frequency. As seasonal fish drying stations continued to spring up onshore, Beothuks raided them when the fishermen were away and during the winter to get European iron, stealing nails, tools, and metal scraps. These were in turn moved down the line to other tribes through established trade routes. In 2011, archaeologists excavated the so called Mantle site at Whitchurch Stowfield in Ontario, near Toronto. This Wendat, the people previously known as Huron village, proved to be the largest Iroquoian site ever found. Radiocarbon evidence showed it to date from 1500 to 1530 AD. That's not old, guys. That's literally after Columbus came. This is what I'm trying to tell you about the Iroquois, guys. They're not that old. They're not really locally like from these areas. Buried in the 500-year-old village was a piece of Portuguese axe. The find shows up in the archaeological record as a full 100 years before the Wendat encountered actual Europeans. So how did they have this knife, guys? Such was the reach of the Red Atlantic that modern archaeologists found this fragment 1,000 miles from the coast from which it was originally taken. As the coast became increasingly occupied, the Beothuk continued to huddle in the interior. Eventually, they were cut off from their traditional coastal resources and economy. Isolated, their numbers dwindled, their world closed in around them. The last known surviving member of the tribe, Shanadi Hit, was captured in 1823 and died in captivity in 1829. The Beothuk were extinct, all right? I have a whole reading about her. I forget what video it is. I think it's in my slave playlist, my real slave trade playlist. And she was described as swarthy, guys. Dark brown, swarthy, copper colored, dark, dark complexioned. All right? He or she, I forget if I think it was a lady. Shana DeWitt, okay? All the way in the 1800s. So Beothuk were extinct. Again, many were sent to other countries as slaves, including Cape Verde in the Caribbean, guys, Hispaniola, all that. Their whole tribe, guys, they didn't go extinct. They're still alive, but they've been reclassified. Yet, even in death, some of the Beothuk made a last macabre voyage on the Atlantic. The macerated skulls of some of the last were sent to Britain for study. Some of these wound up in the National Museum of Scotland in Edinburgh, where they rest uneasily to this day. Wow. Come on, man. That's messed up. Let them rest, right? That of Shana Ditit, the last of the last, was taken to London. It was destroyed during the Blitz in World War II. Ha! You see that? Did they destroy that on purpose? Because if you looked into these skulls, they would prove that these were black folks or Negroes. The skull of so-called Negroes. You know how they do their scientific forensic. You know, you know. Come on, World War. All these World Wars are probably a lot of. Well, not probably. They were literally to hide the past, guys. Part of the reset. Yeah, part of the reset. The slow withering of the Beothuk has been well documented. The elegy has been sung in poetry and prose less than 350 years after John Cabot first stepped on their home island of Newfoundland. They had vanished completely. Our next account of slavery and the Red Atlantic is a story of a much more rapid extinguishment, but both are equally total. All right. And that's where we're going to end it today, guys. This will be, I guess, part one of this chapter one reading, you know, because it's a long chapter. We're on page 57, and I think it goes to page like 80 something. So we'll get the rest of the chapter one in the next video. I might do it tomorrow. Okay. Most likely I will do it tomorrow just to finish it off. I hope you enjoyed the reading. I hope you see how this corroborates for much of our research. And I hope that you apply the context that is missing in this reading from the last 9 years of the research, right? So this is just more icing on the cake. And as you guys can see, they came to enslave American Indians. They knew they were going to do that. They didn't need to go to Africa. None of these primary sources of any of these people talk about going to Africa to get slaves. All right? This is your real slave trade. We're going to end it here for today. Thank you for sticking around all the way to the end of the reading for today, guys. Again, I'm doing this from my bed. Literally, from my bed. I'm lying down right now recording this on Zoom on my phone. I didn't know I could do this. I'm like, let me try this out. So I'm screen sharing from Zoom and I'm recording. And I'm doing this from my bed because it just hurts to be sitting up or walking around or just whatever, holding or anything. And just, hey, it makes it a little easier to get through the pain. I got another appointment today with my chiro right after this today. I'm going to go check him out. I'm going to tell him, hey, I need some more therapy. And we're going to get through this, guys. Don't worry. I'm strong. Thank you for all your advice. Thank you, guys, for, the best wishes. I'm going to get through this nerve pain. It's been hell the last couple of days, guys. I've been, like, literally suffering. Like, literally, guys. But I've gone through things like this so much in my life that it's like, oh, here I go again. And I'm very tolerant to pain. Unfortunately, that's not a good thing because sometimes, I should have acted more in pain when I went to the chiro back on Thursday, and because he kind of just gave me a little massage. He gave me like some medicine that didn't do much, thinking it was just some inflammation or something, right? But I'm going back today. He's gonna look at me. I'm hopeful to get better in the next coming days. I'm still working. I'm still trying to bring the videos. If you like to support what I do, help me out, guys. I got my Patreon page. If you want to go check it out, it's in the link is in the description of all my videos, including this one. If you want to support what I do, there's some great books there. I'm gonna share this one. If I haven't, I'm not sure if I shared it. I think I did, but if not, I'm gonna check and I'm gonna share it for sure. I share most of the books I'm reading nowadays on Patreon. If you like to have these books, because a lot of them they're hard to get. You have to buy them literally. They're hard to get for free. Like I think this is one of them. I might be wrong, but some of them are online. A lot of them are not. So I'm sharing a lot of the ones that are not on my Patreon. If you want to support me, I also have my channel membership. If you want to become a member of my channel, check out my members only videos and things like that. I would appreciate it. Thank you for your support, or everybody who is supporting. Thank you guys for holding me up. Appreciate you guys very much. All right. I'll give you your day back. Again, just more history here. Something for you to think about. Much love and respect. Pura vida, mi gente. Hawaii.